Vážení hoaxery, ctené konšpirátorky. Mali sme pravdu. Medzinárodný covidový summit na pôde Európskeho parlamentu, ale aj výbor pre dohľad a zodpovednosť snemovne Spojených štátov amerických definitívne potvrdil všetko, čo sme dávno vedeli, ale nesmeli povedať.
3 years ago, if you thought it came from a lab, if you raised that, you were called a nut job, you got censored on Twitter, you were blacklisted on Twitter, you were even called a crackpot by the very scientist who in late January sent emails to Dr. Fauci and said it came from a lab. They called you crackpot. Is that right, Dr. Redfield?
I think the most upsetting thing to me was the Baltimore Sun calling me a racist because I said this came from a Wuhan lab.
Dr. Redfield, you ran the CDC and you were on the coronavirus task force. Is that right?
Correct.
That was formed on January 29th. 2020, is that right?
Correct.
2 days later, Dr. Fauci gets an email from Dr. Anderson which says what? Virus looks engineered, virus not consistent with evolutionary theory. Is that accurate?
That's my understanding.
Next day, I know. Did he share that email with you, by the way, Dr. Redfield?
No.
As a member of the task force, as a head of CDC, did he share that email with you?
No.
Okay. Next day, February 1st, Dr. Gary sends Dr. Fauci another email. That email says, I don't know how this happens in nature, but it would be easy to do in a lab. Did he share that email with you, Dr. Redfield?
No.
3 days later, they changed their position 180 degrees. The question is why?
Two of the signatories of the original email to Dr. Fauci, that's Dr. Anderson and Dr. Gary, were awarded a $9 million grant for the...
So there's 9 million reasons why they changed their mind. They get $9 million from Dr. Fauci. So the director of national intelligence knew this thing came from a lab. The Secretary of State knew this thing came from a lab. Common sense tells you this thing came from a lab. And frankly, even the guys who called us names knew it came from a lab because we have their emails. Everyone knew at the get-go. You knew at the get-go. And yet, they tell us just the opposite. Why?
They didn't want unwanted attention to the relationships that were taking place between Western virologists and those working within the Wuhan Institute of Virology and funding sources for some of that research.
Our money to a lab in China that wasn't up to code, that was doing gain-of-function research, and that's where this thing came from. That's what they didn't want us to know. You agree with that, Mr. Ratcliffe?
I do agree with that.
Ani vy neveríte na náhodné úniky a nezabezpečené laboratória? Priznám sa, ťažko veriť rozprávke o náhode, keď o nej odborníci vedeli 4 roky dopredu.
The journal article that said SARS coronavirus is poised for human emergence in 2016. And what, you might ask, Dave, was the coronavirus poised for human emergence? It was WIV1. Wuhan Institute of Virology Virus 1. By the time we get to 2017 and 2018, the following phrase entered into common parlance among the community. There is going to be an accidental or intentional release of a respiratory pathogen. 4 times in April of 2019, 7 months before the allegation of patient number 1, 4 patent applications of Moderna were modified to include the term accidental or intentional release of a respiratory pathogen as the justification for making a vaccine for a thing that did not exist. In September of 2019, the world was informed that we were going to have an accidental or intentional release of a respiratory pathogen so that by September 2020, there would be a worldwide acceptance of a universal vaccine template. That's their words, right in front of you on the screen. The intent was to get the world to accept a universal vaccine template, and the intent was to use coronavirus to get there. And the last slide. Until an infectious disease crisis is very real, present, and at the emergency threshold that is often largely ignored. To sustain the funding base beyond the crisis, he said, we need to increase the public understanding for the need for medical countermeasures such as a pan-influenza or pan-coronavirus vaccine. A key driver is the media, and the economics will follow the hype. We need to use that hype to our advantage to get to the real issues. Investors will respond if they see profit at the end of the process. Sounds like public health? Sounds like the best of humanity? No, ladies and gentlemen, this was premeditated domestic terrorism stated at the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2015, published in front of them. This is an act of biological and chemical warfare perpetrated on the human race, and it was admitted to in writing that this was a financial heist and a financial fraud. Investors will follow if they see profit at the end of the process.
Asi nemusím nikoho presviečať, že médiá si svoju úlohu 100% splnili. Ktokoľvek sa pokusil v televízii alebo denníku povedať niečo iné, ako bola oficiálna pravda, narazil na okamžitú cenzúru. Kritika a odpor voči tejto propagande sa tak presunuli výlučne na sociálne siete, ktoré dovtedy neboli tak kompletne regulované. To sa však rozhodol zmeniť tzv. Virality projekt, ktorý spojil Biely dom a vládne inštitúcie s mimovládnym a akademickým sektorom za jediným cieľom. 24/7 monitorovať sociálne siete a cenzurovať každý nepohodlný názor bez ohľadu na to, či je pravdivý alebo nie.
The Virality Project bragged that 4 major platforms all had high response rates and that 35% of URLs shared with Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube were either labeled, removed, or soft blocked.
FBI agent Elvis Chan testified the FBI alone sends encrypted lists to social media accounts, sometimes containing hundreds of accounts and URLs in each list to platforms for censorship 1 to 5 times per month. Social media platforms boast that it surveilled 859 million tweets, 21,897,364 tweets on tickets as misinformation. Is that right?
That's correct.
Or did the government pressure social media to censor Americans for saying things like natural immunity is real?
Absolutely.
Did the government pressure social media to censor Americans for saying things like gain-of-function research happened in that lab in China?
Absolutely.
Did government pressure social media to censor Americans for saying things like the virus likely came from a lab?
That is right within the heartland of our evidence.
Did government pressure social media to censor Americans for saying things like getting vaccinated doesn't prevent COVID and it doesn't necessarily stop transmission of COVID?
Absolutely.
So all those were true statements, but according to the Democrats, it's fine for the government to pressure social media to take those statements down.
We see email after email after email from the White House, from Mr. Flaherty, pressuring specifically Facebook, but also other social media platforms to take down disfavored viewpoints. And the emphasis in those emails is on true content. The reason that the emphasis on true content is because he almost says this in so many words in one of the emails, that the true content is what they perceive to be doing the most to undermine the narrative that the White House favored at the time.
Myslím, že je každému jasné, že Virality projekt nezanikol, ale v plnom prúde kontroluje a limituje diskusiu na inú aktuálnu tému, ktorá je pre mocných rovnako dôležitá. Čo s tým? Čo s tým vieme spraviť? Na začiatok potrebujeme na čele štátu politikov, ktorí budú v kľúčových momentoch zastupovať bežných ľudí a nie biznisové či záujmové skupiny. Politikov, ktorí si ctia demokraciu, pluralitu názorov a slobodu výberu.
My vyzývame týmto vládu, aby spustila celý ten proces povinného očkovania s tým, že zároveň sme pripravili aj podpisovú kampaň na web stránke za povinné očkovanie, kde sa môžu pridať práve ľudia, ktorí podporujú koncept povinného očkovania. Tomu, ako by sme teda vynúcovali povinné očkovanie my, ak osoba, ktorá odmietne očkovanie, ochorie, tak náklady na jej liečbu nebudú hradené zo zdravotného poistenia. Všetky tie náklady bude musieť znášať sama, budú vymáhateľné, budú exekuovateľné.
Ale hlavne politikov, ktorí nekrútia a nemenia svoj názor podľa toho, ako im to práve vyhovuje.
There are potential side effects in vaccinations, and there are people who've probably gotten very sick from vaccinations. Every vaccine that is approved is safe for Canadians, is uncompromising. Individuals are allowed to make their own choices. There may be all sorts of different reasons why someone is hesitant to get vaccinated. There's no more excuses to not get your shot. And therefore, while not forcing anyone to get vaccinated, enforcement measures in place will make sure that everyone is vaccinated. I chose to make sure that all the incentives and all the protections were there to encourage Canadians to get vaccinated. Don't get to work in the public service. Don't get to go to movie theaters or gyms or restaurants. Now, I see a lot of people nodding along with that, but boy, oh